Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
This is Jeremy Rothgushel.
Okay, so today we're doing our regular weekly 58-minute show, but I think in a couple days we're leaning towards Tuesday right now. We're gonna delve into a long form show. We're really gonna try to pick apart some of the specifics of the geopolitics of this issue related to this major controversy over the last week and a half of Trump's announcement that he's basically going to pull U.S. military presence from Syria that was in place to protect the Kurds, and now this big time outrage within the media, political establishment over this, and leaving the Kurds in the hands of the brutal Erdogan, who, and the narrative surrounding all of that, and pick apart even some of what we're seeing maybe develop with some splits, with some differences within the Trump support base, even regarding this. Trump getting criticism, probably some of the harshest criticism he's gotten from various Zionist evangelical leaders about this whole decision to pull out the presence that's there to protect the Kurds, quote unquote, and we'll get into some of those intrigues, as well as maybe try to get into breakdown our perspective on a country like Turkey, as far as I think a key role it seems to play geopolitically in terms of a lot of issues regarding NATO and Europe, as well as this being one of the epicenters in a lot of the media narratives you'll hear of Islam and the war on terror. And obviously Turkey's directly right at the forefront of this whole Kurd controversy. And we'll get into a few other topics as well, but I think we'll try to make some time this week looking at Tuesday right now, 2 days from today when we're recording this on Sunday, October 13th, to do a long form program and try to get what I think is our unique perspective out there on some of these underlying, or these issues within this bigger issue of this recent pullout, and what it means and what it may or may not mean. But right now, today, we're going to dig into the new Seth Abramson book, Proof of Conspiracy. And Jeremy, we're going to read a lot from chapter 10, which lays out, I think, a lot of the as far as just a lot of the meat and potatoes, maybe as far as just an understanding of some of the intrigues that are going on right now as it relates to the global collusion aspect of the Trump 2016 election or selection, whatever you might call it, and how these factors continue to play into even things like what we're seeing going on right now in Syria, as well as even some of the Ukraine intrigue. It's interesting that the people who were cited in that in our profile photo we used for our show on Giuliani in Ukraine were just recently arrested this past week, the Ukrainians. So we're going to get into chapter 10 of Seth Abramson's book here, Proof of Conspiracy. Is there anything you want to say before we get into the book and get into the chapter?
Two quick things. One thing, of course, as always, that one of the things we like to do here is apply our own analysis that we hope is thoughtful and well-informed to different fact proposals or presentations, right? So, as always, when we read from a book or an article, we're not endorsing all of the analyses or even all of the necessary, that every single fact is proven, although it does not look like that any of the actual facts that have been asserted in Seth Abramson's book have been knocked down or disputed in any ways, and his source list is massive. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean just because it was sourced from international news somewhere, there is, of course, such things as black propaganda and facts that are purposely false or facts that have been smeared in some way. So that's why we take responsibility for our analysis while being open to a diverse array of fact bases in which to base that analysis of ours. Okay, so that's point one. And so we'll preserve some of the some of the deeper analysis that we might have, as you laid out, for our longer form conversation in a few days. And then secondly, Greg, anytime here that you have any urge to jump in and add a fact or a piece of analysis, please feel free to aggressively do so, okay?
All right, sounds good.
All right. So this is from Proof of Conspiracy: How Trump's International Collusion is Threatening American Democracy by Seth Abramson, the author of the former book Proof of Collusion. Okay, Chapter 10, titled The Syria Withdrawal, the Yemeni Civil War, Secret Summits, and the Saudi Nuclear Deal, December 2018 to March 2019. Quote, as Trump threatens to precipitously withdraw U.S. forces from Syria and end U.S. participation in NATO, both outcomes that would greatly please his would-be ally Vladimir Putin, he continues generously funding the Saudis' and Emiratis' ill-conceived military intervention in Yemen, whose human toll has by the end of 2018 become incalculable. Trump increasingly becomes the executor of the designs of his new allies, spreading propaganda for the Kremlin, advocating for the creation of Saudi Arabia's proposed Sunni Arab security alliance, advancing a Saudi nuclear deal after exiting a nuclear deal with Iran while the Iranians were in compliance, and making his phone calls open to Russian intercepts. In Warsaw, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu states outright what many have long suspected, that Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, and the Trump administration are hoping for a war with Iran. As 2018 ends, the top priority for both Russia and the Red Sea conspirators is the removal of Syria as a hot-button issue in the region. According to The Guardian, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt want the end of the Syrian civil war and the readmittance to the Arab League of Syria and its president Bashar al-Assad, repeatedly accused of war crimes, to, quote, mark the definitive death of the Arab Spring and the hopes of the region's popular revolutions, unquote. Per the British news outlet, if MBS and Egypt's Abdel Fattah el-Sisi can stand, quote, shoulder to shoulder, unquote, with al-Assad, with all three men in complete control of their respective countries, it will communicate to the world that the transnational push for democracy across the Middle East, known as the, quote, Arab Spring, unquote, was, quote, crushed by the newest generation of Middle Eastern strongmen, unquote. The first sign of a shift in Saudi, Emirati, and Egyptian attitudes toward the Syrian civil war had come earlier in 2018 when Bahrain, another Red Sea conspirator, permitted its foreign minister Khalid bin Ahmed al-Khalifa to, quote, warmly shake the hand, unquote, of the Syrian foreign minister Walid al-Muallem on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. An event al-Assad revealed in October 2018 signified that Syria had reached, quote, a major understanding, unquote, with several Arab states. The second major sign of a thaw between MBS and al-Assad comes in mid-December 2018 when Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir visits al-Assad in Syria, a move, quote, widely interpreted as a gesture of friendship on behalf of Saudi Arabia, unquote. According to The Guardian, quote, for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, re-embracing Syria is a new strategy aimed at pivoting Assad away from Tehran's sphere of influence, unquote.
And what could explain, it's interesting that you're bringing out this, what might be called a thaw in relations or an improvement, if not an outright improvement in relations between, MBS of Saudi Arabia and Assad of Syria. And of course, Saudi Arabia, perhaps rightly, was seen as one of the primary agitators as far as when it was during the overt efforts from Western administrations, it appears to have actually attempted to perhaps carry out some type of regime change operation in Syria. Saudi Arabia was seen obviously as being right at the forefront of that, one of the primary movers in that. But now you're seeing with this MBS, who very clearly has been supported by many of the obviously hardline neocons from a global perspective, particularly obviously here in the U.S. as well as, you could say definitely Israel's been very supportive of MBS. And the Russian role on MBS remains a little more ambiguous, although Vladimir Putin has the only photo ops we have of them are very positive, and I believe there's still Russian, Saudi Arabian weapons cooperation sales going on even it seems, to this current time. So,
And didn't they give each other a high five, Putin and
Yes, they did. That was what I was
MBS?
referring to, the interactions between them. Yes, and RT was touting that and spinning that in a positive manner, which is very interesting if you listen to, RT America, how critical it is of, say, Saudi Arabia and MBS and the butchery going on with all of that. But I think what would explain a lot of this is we go back to, and obviously I don't know if Seth Abramson is certainly not in a position to make this type of political leap with his commentary, whether he'd want to or not, is, I think, the going back to what we've laid out with the clean break document and what it was actually laid out in there, and that there was never an actual blueprint for actual regime change in Syria, but more or less of a balkanization like what we saw with the, maybe with the former Yugoslavia and the Eastern European countries, a balkanizing of Syria to a point where, on one hand, it will likely never be a threat again, say, to, Zionist Israeli hegemony. But at the same time, it's not just a overt type of regime change operation like we saw with Saddam Hussein. And I think also in some ways this may go back to what we've laid out as kind of this good cop, or our theory of the good cop, bad cop narrative, where basically the U.S. and the West comes in and sets up all these radical Muslim groups and this narrative. And then, you get the good guys come in and play good cop and clean up the mess and take out the radicals. And even the rise of someone like MBS to power has been portrayed by some as the shifting away of Saudi Arabia from supporting radicalism and all this. It's like Saudi Arabia cleaning out its own deep state. So when we look at this from this perspective, it almost makes sense that you would see, even among these, what we're seeing at one point, a steadfast protagonist right at the forefront of the operation against Syria and Assad at the beginning. It makes sense in some ways that you're bringing this up with MBS and Assad, and even the at the very least a thaw in these relations. And so I think it very well does appear that it makes sense if you look at it from this perspective.
Well, thank you for those additional analyses there. And I would just also maybe add that even in terms of our analysis of the good cop, bad cop, with the Russia playing the quote unquote good cop who comes in after the fact to quote unquote clean up the Islamic radicals, with our more recent investigations into the background of Putin and Russia in the Chechen wars, and what we were discovering about the potential role of Russian intelligence in managing aspects even of Chechen opposition, we then have to wonder whether even that division is more complex than we once asserted, and that covertly it's very possible that Russia is playing a similar game that certain aspects of the West and NATO and Israel are playing, in terms of covertly supporting aspects of what might be called the Islamic radicals that they then go in and clean up. It's the same imperial game in many ways, right? It's the idea of creating counter gangs that both discredit your potential, political opposition, while also giving you reason to go in and use covert military operations, or even eventually overt military operations to defeat them.
Yeah, it sure seems that way, and it also puts an element of control over whichever group is being funded or being enabled, to where they only have a certain amount of power to only, it's very managed, it seems like. But that does seem to be the case in so many different conflicts over the years, and currently going on to this day, obviously. So,
okay, so page 466, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. After talking about a new strategy aimed at pivoting Assad away from Tehran's sphere of influence. Okay, quote, in the view of, quote, especially Emirati and Egyptian leaders, unquote, The Guardian reports, Syria's president is, quote, one of them, an Arab autocrat fighting against what they consider subversive forces, unquote. Meanwhile, quote, calls in Egypt and Gulf media for Syria's reinstatement to the Arab League, unquote, are spreading, as are, quote, rumors about the reopening of the Emirati embassy in Damascus, which observers believe would serve as a back channel for Saudi diplomatic overtures, unquote. Concurrently, Jordan, another nation present at the founding of the Red Sea conspiracy, quote, reopens a southern border crossing, unquote, to Syria. Even so, December 2018 is still early days for normalization of the Gulf states' ties to Syria, and there is no indication that any politician in the United States is interested in following suit. The Guardian notes that, quote, for the West, Syria is likely to remain a pariah state, unquote. According to one top European diplomat speaking in December, quote, there is no credible, genuine settlement process underway yet in Syria, so fundamentally there's still no incentive for reconciliation with the regime, unquote. In Syria, as elsewhere, Russia's interests once again partially align with those of the Red Sea conspirators and Israel. Indeed, quote, Israel is working with Russia to reduce tensions in the disputed Golan Heights, unquote, reports The Guardian. It is clear that if the United States can be convinced in the coming months and years to withdraw its forces from Syria and cede the country back to its autocratic head of state, it will give Russia free rein to continue its military operations in the country without fear of interference from American forces. Just so...
And likely without interference from Israeli forces.
Yes. Quote, just so, Putin can find greater profit in his government's special political and economic relationship with Syria once al-Assad's regime and the nation he leads is brought back into the international community of nations on equal footing with regional peers. Therefore, the chief problem for Putin, MBS, MBZ, and al-Sisi as December 2018 begins, is that there simply has been no serious contemplation in the United States of withdrawing American forces from Syria and thereby opening a path to a political solution to the Syria question, critically one that involves al-Assad remaining in power. Indeed, such a policy would run directly counter to America's long-standing goals in the region, including both its humanitarian ambitions with respect to the prevention of future war crimes and its geopolitical ones, notably the direct and indirect fostering of revolutionary movements seeking the spread of democracy in the Middle East. While Saudi Arabia makes its first public gesture of friendship toward al-Assad in early December 2018, the notion that Saudi policy should lead to any change in American policy in Syria in either the short or medium term is beyond mainstream policy discussion in Washington. One indication of this is that even as Sudan's al-Bashir and Syria's al-Assad meet, the U.S. State Department is, quote, pressuring both Riyadh and Cairo to hold off on demanding a vote, unquote, in the Arab League to readmit Syria, a move that would complicate American military operations there. All of the foregoing notwithstanding, on December 19, Donald Trump shocks America and the world when CNN reports that, quote, planning is underway for a full and rapid withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria, a decision made by President Trump, according to a U.S. defense official, unquote. The same day, Trump tweets, quote, we have defeated ISIS in Syria, my only reason for being there during the Trump presidency, unquote. In response, a Pentagon official gives the following statement to CNN, quote, so when does Russia announce their victory, unquote? The answer turns out to be, quote, within hours, unquote, as Putin, in the mid-afternoon of December 19, issues a statement through Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, lauding Trump's decision as offering, quote, a real prospect for a political solution in Syria, unquote.
And also, I will mention that in the aftermath of this, we analyzed and we cited and analyzed Jake Turks, an Orthodox Jewish reporter whose claims were later at least mentioned on air on Breitbart Radio by Carolyn Glick of the Jerusalem Post, that this actual pullout was done actually to get the Americans out of the way of Israeli operations against Hezbollah. So whatever that's worth as well, that's another aspect that might have been involved with this December 2018 decision that really hasn't been discussed a whole lot. And we'll link back to the show we did in those direct sources in the show notes for this show, but that was another factor that might be at play that really I don't think's gotten a lot of traction, as well as the obvious Russian angle to Russia seeing this decision as a victory. So,
thank you for remembering that, because that the resonance with the current moment is really parallel in terms of, you know, getting American troops out of the way so Israel can go against Hezbollah, as getting American troops out of the way so the Turks can go after the Kurds. Or it sounds sort of similar. Thank you. So yeah, let's link to that show. Okay, page 468, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, the next day, Putin adds that, quote, if the U.S. has decided to withdraw its military contingent, it has done the right thing, unquote. Putin may well be responding to news released the same day that as part of its Syria withdrawal, the United States is, quote, set to close a base in Syria, which has drawn the ire of Russia, as special forces will be withdrawn from the Al-Tanf base near the Syrian border with Jordan, unquote. A significant development for the Kremlin because, quote, Russia has frequently condemned the U.S. presence at Al-Tanf. In a response to the U.S. leaving the country, Russian officials specifically noted that de-escalation would now be possible near the base, unquote. That Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Igor Tsarikov had said on December 11th that, quote, there is growing concern in Moscow related to the dubious activity of the U.S. and its allies in Syria, unquote, might also help explain Trump's announcement, the impetus for which arose, according to GOP sources in Washington on December 11. Less than 2 hours after Russia issues its first statement on Trump's Syria withdrawal, the president takes the unusual step of canceling a meeting with the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker of Tennessee, doing so while Corker is waiting in the White House to meet with him. Reports following the snub indicate that Corker was planning to ask Trump about Syria. One report notes that Corker, along with, quote, many senators, unquote, was, quote, blindsided by Trump's decision to pull all 2,000 U.S. troops out of Syria as quickly as possible, unquote. Notably, Trump cancels his meeting with Corker, the most powerful Republican legislator in the United States on the subject of foreign policy, even though he has no public events on his schedule for the day. During the evening of December 19, Corker says to NBC News of Trump's decision to withdraw from Syria, quote, there are significant concerns about what's happened. I've never seen a decision like this since I've been here. In 12 years, where nothing is communicated in advance, and all of a sudden this type of massive decision takes place. It's caught everybody off guard. I doubt that there's anybody in the Republican caucus in the Senate that just isn't stunned by this precipitous decision that, like, you woke up in the morning and made it, unquote. Corker adds that it's a, quote, terrible thing for the nation, unquote. As summarized by Atlantic media journalist Katie Bowe Williams, Corker would later note, following a classified call with the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, that, according to Mattis, quote, there does not appear to have been any interagency process to the withdrawal decision, unquote, meaning that even the Pentagon was not informed beforehand by the president. Okay, and aside right there, I just want to quickly note that sounds similar to the kind of processes that were going on via AIPAC style and direct AIPAC lobby elements during the run-up and management of the Iraq War. Especially, I'm thinking of the question of Michael Makovsky being inserted beyond the actual security clearance desires and policies of the Pentagon itself to head up the Iraq oil policy, apparently on behalf of Israeli elements in AIPAC.
Yeah, that's a great point. And regardless of what the pro-Trump base will dismiss like any type of media criticism of Trump as having an erratic foreign policy or whatever you hear of it as, oh, that's just nonsense because, he's a meticulous, careful thinker and all this, and they just want to make him seem like he's erratic to get people turned against him. But on its face, this does just sound very erratic and very, it does. I mean, obviously, I think there's much more intrigue going on than just an erratic foreign policy, whatever you want to call it. But on its face, it does sound very chaotic and like it's unprepared and just constantly changing at the moment without any type of correspondence or notifications. And honestly, we should want there to be continuity of understanding of what's going on with these crucial operations. And I think that's a problem if we don't have any continuity.
And either this has the sound of a very stable 3D chess genius
Very stable genius, yeah.
making unexpected moves against the deep state, Or more likely, it sounds like someone who's getting, favors called in in a mob kind of situation of people that he owes for very specific reasons that also probably have specific benefit to him as a mob lieutenant of some sort. That's what it really sounds like.
Yeah, sure.
Like
I
to
was
me.
just. I agree.
No.
I
I was just sort of filling that implication in. Yeah.
definitely.
Okay, so page 469, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, following Trump's announcement, Mattis quickly resigns as Secretary of Defense, even as, according to the Times of Israel, Trump's claim that ISIS has been defeated is being, quote, largely rejected by defense analysts and officials from around the world, unquote. A circumstance that opens up the question of which intelligence services, if any, have told Trump that ISIS has been eradicated in Syria. Brett McGurk, quote, the U.S. envoy leading the coalition to defeat ISIS, unquote, also, like Mattis, quote, resigns in protest, unquote, of Trump's actions. In a last email to his staff, McGurk writes, quote, I ultimately concluded that I could not carry out these new instructions from the president and maintain my integrity at the same time, unquote. At the time of McGurk's resignation, there are 2,000 U.S. soldiers in Syria and an estimated 2,000 to 8,000 ISIS fighters. If ISIS fighters in neighboring Iraq are counted, the size of the ISIS force increases to 30,000, according to NBC News. Reaction to Trump's Syria announcement across the Republican Party is exactly as Corker anticipates. On the same day as Trump's declaration, Representative Adam Kinzinger, Republican of Illinois, calls Trump's claim that ISIS has been defeated, quote, simply not true, unquote. Trump ally Lindsey Graham calls the decision, quote, a big win for ISIS, Iran, Bashar al-Assad of Syria, and Russia, unquote, adding that it will, quote, lead to devastating consequences for our nation, the region, and throughout the world, unquote.
Well, Lindsey, if you're really concerned about it, then why don't you try to get to the bottom of the actual nature of what got this person who's putting this dangerous foreign policy into place elected? Well, you're probably part of it at some level, so you don't want to, but that would be the natural thing.
I'll look into my own closeted issues. Thanks, Guy. I appreciate that. And back to page 470, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, and that the idea that ISIS is defeated is, quote, fake news, unquote. What? Okay. Senator Marco Rubio, Republican of Florida, labels the decision a, quote, grave error, unquote, a, quote, colossal mistake, unquote, and a, quote, bad decision that will eventually lead to greater risk for the United States, unquote. Senator Ben Sasse, Republican of Nebraska, calling the announcement a, quote, weak decision, unquote, notes that, quote, 8 days ago on December 11, the administration called a hypothetical pullout from Syria reckless. Today we're leaving. The president's generals have no idea where this weak decision came from. A lot of American allies will be slaughtered if this retreat is implemented, unquote. One place the idea of a Syria withdrawal may have originated is longtime Trump advisor Eric Prince, who, according to Haaretz, has been making, quote, the case to Trump that the United States should replace its small footprint of 2,000 troops in Syria with mercenaries, unquote, specifically Prince's mercenaries.
Yes, and on that note, and I'll try to lessen the interruptions.
No, it's okay.
We get through the chapter. But on that note, Eric Prince, there's a video of Eric Prince on Lou Dobbs' show on the Fox Business Channel. I'm not sure if he said this in other places, but particularly the idea of very much pushing a coalition among some of these Arab these countries, like basically this almost like this Arab League, what we were talking about earlier, coalition to basically handle the situation in Syria, and that would replace the U.S. military presence, very similar to replacing the U.S. military presence with more of this private, whatever you want, military for operations in Afghanistan. So that would make sense, as Prince was on the Lou Dobbs show on Fox Business Channel, almost specifically laying out the process of replacing the U.S. military presence in Syria with basically an Arab coalition. So
back to page 470, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, Prince is thereby, quote, eyeing a major comeback, unquote, Haaretz writes, from his tumultuous reign as head of the quote-unquote infamous company once known as Blackwater. whose private military contractors were accused and convicted of carrying out homicides in Iraq. Prince had previously pitched Trump on the idea of, quote, replacing troops in Afghanistan with private military contractors that would report to a special viceroy for the war who would report directly to the president, unquote. A year later, Trump, quote, vowed to draw down the 7,000 troops from Afghanistan, unquote. Prince would likely have made Trump aware, with respect to both Syria and other military theaters, that Vladimir Putin had long since given his approval to a well-known Russian private military company, Wagner Group, quote, working and pursuing their interests anywhere in the world, unquote, as long as they do not, quote, break Russian law, unquote. And aside, I wonder if killing journalists in Africa is against Russian law. I don't know. Okay, back to the
Stop being a McCarthyite, Jeremy.
Yeah,
Stop being a McCarthyite. Focus on your own country.
Just your classic McCarthyite, I am. Okay, back to the text. Quote, with the Russian president calling such mercenary companies, quote, an instrument in the pursuit of national interests without the direct participation of the state, unquote. Immediately after Mattis resigns over Trump's policy shift on Syria, Blackwater takes out a full-page ad in firearms enthusiast magazine Recoil that implies it will shortly be resuming operations. The ad, written in large white capital letters against a black background, says simply, quote, we are coming, unquote. And aside here, John Swin wrote a very interesting article after this the moment that I think is the deepest analysis on the internet about specifically this question of the reemergence of Blackwater and Prince in relationship to Afghanistan and all of that.
It was a very convenient, because a lot of media, particularly like RT America type media, did pick up on this as a way to easily, in some ways you could say easily scapegoat Blackwater without in that way you don't have to have a bigger picture analysis, and you can just scapegoat Blackwater or whoever for whatever could be coming down the road. So that is certainly an interesting perspective on this. But there's no doubt that whatever's going on, Eric Prince and his groups, whatever they're calling themselves, they're very major players in all of this from a global perspective. That was an interesting perspective from John on that particular article layout.
Back to the text. Quote, international reaction to Trump's Syria announcement is unambiguous. A senior French official tells the Associated Press that France does not, quote, share the assessment, unquote, of the situation in Syria that Trump has, and believes if the withdrawal is, quote, made too quickly, it will affect not only stability in the region, but also the security of the people in the Syrian Democratic Forces, unquote. Germany's foreign minister, Heiko Maas, issues a statement saying that, quote, the threat from ISIS is not yet over, unquote, and, quote, the abrupt change of course by the American side comes as a surprise not only for us, unquote. Indeed, it appears Trump has also neglected to tell America's allies in Syria. The Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, issue a statement declaring that, quote, the war against Islamic State has not ended and the group has not been defeated, unquote. Meanwhile, America's Kurdish allies are, according to the Associated Press, quote, rattled, unquote, and, quote, surprised, unquote, and see the move, quote, as an abandonment of a loyal ally, unquote, after which one Kurdish journalist tells the AP, quote, we have every right to be afraid, unquote. Media reaction to Trump's announcement is along the same lines as everyone else's. Politico immediately issues a report on Trump's decision, calling it, quote, calamitous, unquote, quote-unquote, a mistake, quote-unquote, ill-considered, and a move that will, quote, will not end well, unquote, noting that, quote, ISIS pockets remain in the eastern parts of Syria, and there have already been signs that they are regenerating, unquote. The digital news outlet observes that the, quote, breach, unquote, Trump is leaving may well be filled by, quote, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, unquote, leading it to conclude that Trump is undercutting its commitment to, quote, America's Arab and Israeli partners, unquote. The answer to Sass's question, what happened between December 11 and December 19 to change Trump's mind about Syria, may also be the answer to the query from Politico about how America's, quote, Arab and Israeli partners, unquote, will react to the news that America is leaving Syria. The meeting between Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, the latter a, quote, key ally for the Saudis and Emiratis, unquote, who was once disfavored but is now, quote, welcomed again by Cairo and Riyadh, unquote, according to the Middle East Eye, occurred on December 16. The London-based Middle East watchdog notes that, quote, Saudi Arabia's role in the al-Bashir trip is not to be discounted, unquote, adding that the, quote, clear message that Bashir brings to al-Assad is that the Arab League is ready to take Syria back and talk to Assad for full restoration of ties. The Saudis and the Arab League want Syria to retake its premier position as the main force in the Levant and push back Iranian and Turkish influence in the region, unquote. Trump's decision on withdrawing from Syria therefore comes within 72 hours of his most prominent Arab ally and backer, MBS, making his first public acknowledgement through al-Bashir that a political rather than military solution in Syria is the best answer, for Saudi Arabia at least. There is evidence, however, that MBS is thinking not just about Saudi Arabia and Syria, but about Russia as well. The Middle East Eye reports, shortly after the al-Bashir visit, that, quote, some Arab states are looking to Russia as being a positive influence in the Middle East, after years of American and European failure in Libya, Iraq, and Yemen. Russia is seen as a success given how it has managed to decisively alter the course of the war in Syria.
That's very convenient from the idea perspective that, you know, there's certainly an element that's at play at some level to discredit the United States globally. So this fits right into that.
So back to the text 472, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson, the middle of a quote. Quote, the message was not lost in Washington on December 16 that the Sudanese president arrived on a Russian plane, unquote. The implication of this observation is that MBS, MBZ, and al-Sisi may not merely be sanguine at the prospect of America ceding Syria to Russian influence and an ongoing Russian military presence, but in fact perhaps would, contrary to what Trump's Republican colleagues are presuming back at home, strongly prefer it. Israel, another country ostensibly threatened by Trump's decision, is likewise more ambivalent about the announcement than anyone not familiar with the Red Sea conspiracy might expect. In response to the news that the U.S. forces will be abandoning Syria, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, widely but wrongly believed by many in Washington to consider himself betrayed by Trump's announcement, does not decry the move, but instead calls Trump to discuss, quote, ways to continue cooperation between Israel and the United States against Iranian aggression, unquote. He adds that he is confident Israel has, quote, complete support and backing from the United States, unquote. While Trump will dispatch to Israel his national security advisor John Bolton in early January, it will not be because the Israelis wish to convince the United States to stay in Syria, but merely to discuss how, quote, swift, unquote, the withdrawal will be, as a too hasty removal of U.S. forces could, quote, enable Iran to expand its influence and presence in Syria, unquote. That Netanyahu disputes only the logistics of Trump's stunning gambit in Syria, rather than expressing shock at the bare fact of it, leaves open the possibility that Netanyahu, and perhaps other actors in the region or in Moscow, had more notice of the administration's dramatic announcement than the Pentagon did. The Associated Press will report that Israel was the first country to learn of Trump's final decision after Turkey, which learned of it on December 14. Confirming that Netanyahu might have known about Trump's plan before the Pentagon did, as even on December 19, the Pentagon was indicating that it was caught off guard by the finality and certainty of Trump's declaration. What is not clear is if Netanyahu is on the same page as his own military commanders with respect to Trump's announcement on Syria. While the Times of Israel will report that, quote, top Israeli government officials have publicly refrained from criticizing the move, unquote, Israeli intelligence officials tell the New York Times that they do indeed feel, quote-unquote, betrayed by Trump's decision. The Times, noting that Netanyahu is, quote, a close ally of Mr. Trump's, unquote, will observe that the Israeli intelligence officials who spoke to the paper did so, quote, on condition of anonymity, unquote, suggesting that they were not cleared by Netanyahu's office to publicly dispute Trump's plan.
Honestly, Jeremy, it sounds to me like a lot of there's so much ambiguity, so much still not known, because one of the constants that I see in the media in the aftermath of these kind of decisions, like you're seeing it now with the Kurds, like, Netanyahu remains silent on Trump's Kurd decision. Why? And, people will say, well, he was trying to keep Trump happy because he doesn't want Trump to like erratically turn on him in the process of like the deal of the century or whatever. But just as valid, and I think in some ways even more valid of a possible understanding is where even Netanyahu would disagree with his own military professionals within the Israeli establishment, much like the situation with the Trump administration, is that where is Netanyahu indebted to? Who is Netanyahu indebted to? What forces are steering a lot of his decision making in terms of Israeli foreign policy? So,
a good question, and that is where that deeper analysis of the mob background, and especially this relationship to the quote-unquote red mafia that deals with the closeness of people like Sharansky and Netanyahu, and even who is Ariel Sharon and all of that. Those deeper analyses, I think, are definitely playing a role here in terms of understanding, and it's an aspect that's not really deeply touched on in Abramson's book, so I believe that he misses aspects of what's going on here. But on the surface here, he's dealing with some of the facts that show that the silence of Netanyahu here is actually indicative of a private understanding and probably a private agreement or a servicing of a Netanyahu-friendly agenda here. Okay, back to page 473, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, what they tell the Times underscores, however, that Netanyahu's alliance with the U.S. president simultaneously seeking to be allied with the Russians is a perpetual dilemma for Netanyahu's government. Per the Times, quote, one Israeli intelligence official said the United States was practically evacuating the Middle East, leaving Russia as the sole global power there, unquote. Saudi Arabia's designs on becoming a superpower in the Middle East go unmentioned. MBS's plan for Syria becomes clear in the week after Trump's surprise announcement. By the day after Christmas, The Guardian is writing, quote, for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, re-embracing Syria is a new strategy aimed at pivoting Assad away from Tehran's sphere of influence. Fueled by the promise of normalized trade relations and reconstruction money, as Riyadh's pockets are much deeper than Tehran's and Moscow's, unquote. In ending America's long-standing foreign policy in Syria without so much as a call to the Pentagon, and in doing so in a fashion and on a schedule that aligns with MBS's intricate designs, Trump therefore capitulates to Riyadh and the Kremlin, even as the outcry within his own political party wrongly suggests that no one in the Middle East or anywhere else is pleased with his decision. To say if the two men had discussed... Oh, sorry. Skipped a page there by accident. Page 474, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, MBS's Syria policy in December 2018 is a far cry from what it was in December 2017, when Trump, then on a tear about the expense of keeping soldiers in and rebuilding Syria, contacted King Salman to ask the Saudis to contribute more money to the Syrian reconstruction effort. In response, Salman pledged $4 billion, just 1% of the amount of money needed to rebuild Syria's devastated infrastructure. By December 2018, however, the Saudis are ready to commit significantly greater resources to the effort. Consequently, though it may appear to American voters that Trump is abandoning Syria to stand firm on his oft-expressed complaint about U.S. military expenditures abroad, his thinking instead appears responsive to the mercurial whims of Riyadh, rather than any avowed principle. That Trump may have coordinated his capitulation to the Saudis, Emiratis, and Russians with MBS at a minimum is indicated by a tweet from Trump just 5 days after his withdrawal announcement. On Christmas Eve, MBS had given Trump political cover on Syria by indicating that the Saudis would fund Syrian reconstruction, estimated in January 2019 to require a $400 billion investment in total. Trump tweets out in response to these assurances, quote, Saudi Arabia has now agreed to spend the necessary money needed to help rebuild Syria instead of the United States. See, isn't it nice when immensely wealthy countries help rebuild their neighbors rather than a great country, that's capitalized, the U.S., that is 5,000 miles away?
While lying about the nature of the wars and the military interventions that created the chaos in the first place, yes.
Thanks to Saudi Arabia, unquote.
Yeah.
What Trump does not reveal is that the Russians are now also planning to move into the Syria reconstruction business, with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace making note of, quote, Russia's growing focus on Syria's economic reconstruction, unquote, which, quote, Russia wants to benefit from as a foreign capital influx into the Syrian economy could provide vital hard currency for Russian businesses, unquote.
By the way, I wonder how much of this was being discussed and going on during the much heralded, much maligned Trump-Putin summit in Helsinki, and where Trump, on several occasions, including on Tucker Carlson's show, put specific emphasis on how much Israel was benefiting from these wonderful meetings he and Putin were having. So,
and Putin's a big fan of Bibi, right? Putin's a big fan.
Fake, Jeremy. Don't worry about it. That's not. Don't even entertain the possibility.
Okay, back to the text, page 474 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, Trump's announcement that the United States will not participate in the Syrian reconstruction process is therefore a concession to Saudi and Russian interests, which will now dominate a burgeoning sub-economy in the Middle East. An aside, right? Isn't this all about in terms of the bunting cloverleaf plan for the world? This is the epicenter of the new world, the new world order, as they might be said, right? Okay. Back to the text. Quote, in late December, a new revelation regarding the factors that led to Trump's December 19 Syria decision shifts the focus temporarily from Trump's conversation with Putin in Helsinki and Kushner's conversations with MBS in Riyadh, the latter concurrent to al-Assad reaching a mysterious, quote, major understanding, unquote, with the Saudis, to a conversation Trump had with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on December 14. According to NBC News, the Trump administration had originally told reporters that during the December 14 call, Trump, quote, merely informed Erdogan of his plans to withdraw, unquote, from Syria. In fact, the media will learn that Trump agreed to withdraw from Syria after, quote, Erdogan reportedly promised that Turkey would take responsibility for finishing off the Islamic State if the U.S. pulled out of Syria, unquote. According to a senior White House official, Erdogan, who had met directly with Vladimir Putin just 13 days earlier at the G20 summit, said to Trump, quote, as your friend, I give you my word in this, unquote. The Washington Post will imply that Trump's conversation with Erdogan on December 14 is, whether planned as such or not, effectively a follow-up to the duo's conversation about Syria at the G20, where in addition to meeting with Putin, Erdogan met with Trump to express, quote, his inability to understand why the United States was still arming and supporting Syrian Kurdish fighters to conduct a ground war against the Islamic State, unquote. Trump had met with Putin at the G20 summit as well. Despite announcing publicly before the summit his intention of avoiding the Russian president in Buenos Aires, Trump in fact secretly met with him twice, in both instances meetings at which no note-takers or aides were present, and journalists found out only after the fact and by accident, not from the White House. One meeting was a conversation at a, quote, cultural dinner closed to reporters, unquote. Another meeting the next day was revealed by Putin rather than any U.S. source. According to the Russian president, he and Trump discussed, quote, the situation in Ukraine, unquote. Historically a code word for U.S. sanctions against Russia for Putin's illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in early 2014. That Trump, despite his public posturing, had likely always intended to meet with Putin in Buenos Aires is suggested by the Russians' more candid stance on the matter. According to USA Today, quote, Kremlin officials insisted throughout the first day of the G20 that the two leaders would ultimately meet, unquote. Because of how Trump orchestrated his two meetings with Putin, however, no one in the media was in a position to say if the two men had discussed Syria, the Turkish president's G20 meeting with Putin, or anything else that might have informed Trump's thinking on leaving Syria to the Russians and Saudis just 13 days later. Another meeting in which Putin is involved at the G20 will raise eyebrows as well, as Putin and MBS are caught on videotape high-fiving each other excitedly and, per CNN, exchanging, quote, huge smiles and handshakes, unquote. Other, more esoteric 2018 events, like a threat issued 120 days earlier by one of Turkey's major political parties to, quote, seize 2 Trump towers, unquote, in Istanbul if Trump didn't end sanctions against 2 top Turkish officials, may also have been on Trump's mind when he capitulated to Erdogan. Certainly, Trump appeared to be unusually solicitous with the Turkish president on December 14, when he suddenly agreed to withdraw U.S. forces in response to Erdogan's promise during their mid-December phone call, saying, according to the Post, quote, "You know what? It's yours. I'm leaving," unquote. Erdogan was, according to the Associated Press, so stunned at the speed and finality of Trump's capitulation that, suddenly contradicting himself, he, quote, cautioned Trump against a hasty withdrawal, unquote. White House officials are oddly candid with the media about how, quote, hastily Trump made his decision to exit Syria, a negative shading of Trump's behavior that would normally serve no purpose to the White House. While it is true, as the Associated Press notes, that Trump's decision was made, quote, without consulting his national security team or allies, and over strong objections from virtually everyone involved in the fight against the Islamic State group, and stunned his cabinet, lawmakers, and much of the world in rejecting the advice of his top aides, unquote, the fact remains that Trump's national security advisor John Bolton knew of Trump's intention to withdraw from Syria as early as his first day in the White House, April 9, 2018, and hid that fact from national security officials elsewhere in the U.S. government in early September, see Chapter 9. Bolton, who was on the Trump-Erdogan phone call, was, according to the Associated Press, quote, forced to admit to Trump, unquote, that ISIS retained only, quote, 1%, unquote, of its former territory in Syria, but having also argued that victory over ISIS had to be, quote, unquote, and enduring, was purportedly, quote, unquote, shocked when Trump agreed to withdraw U.S. forces. And yet he had been told long before by the president himself that Trump was inclined to do just that, and Trump's meeting at the G20 likewise would have seemed to counter any claim that his decision had been a sudden one. On December 22nd, Trump appears to concede that he was thinking about more than just the Turkish president's promise to him when he made his decision, tweeting that, quote, other local countries, unquote, would be working simultaneously with Turkey to, quote, easily take care of whatever remains, unquote, of ISIS, a reference to unnamed nations that by simple process of elimination would seem to include Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. While messages from the White House are mixed between December 14 and December 22nd, National Security Council spokesman Garrett Markey will say that the story of the Trump-Erdogan phone call is false and comes, quote, possibly from unnamed sources in Turkey, unquote. Meanwhile, unnamed White House, quote-unquote, officials will say that the Trump-Erdogan call was originally set up so that Trump could, quote, tell Erdogan to back off, unquote, from attacking Kurdish forces in northern Syria, as doing so could endanger American forces, but that during the call Trump, quote, ignored the script and sided with Erdogan, unquote. A telling of events that has the president deliberately putting American soldiers in harm's way for at least the duration of any Syria pullout. Whatever the truth may be, the accusations and counter-accusations that surround Trump's decision on Syria leave a cloud of doubt around the possibility of an imminent U.S. withdrawal from the war-torn country, one that obscures not just the timeline of Trump's decision on the matter, but an itemization of the beneficiaries of his gambit. In mid-January 2019, Trump again upends U.S. foreign policy in a way certain to please MBS and MBZ when, on January 13, he publicly threatens a country with which they have had hostile relations, Turkey, even though Turkey is a NATO ally. Trump associates his threat with his own inopportune withdrawal of American troops from Syria, tweeting that he will be, quote, starting the long overdue pullout from Syria while hitting the little remaining ISIS territorial caliphate hard, will attack ISIS again from existing nearby base if it reforms, will devastate Turkey economically if they hit Kurds, unquote. Trump threatening a radical Islamist death cult and a NATO ally in consecutive sentences necessitates Secretary of State Mike Pompeo calling Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu to, quote, agree on the importance of continuing U.S.-Turkish consultations, unquote, over Syria.
Funny how he just did that again this week. It sounds like smoke and mirrors, it seems like.
Yes. Trump's quote, back to the text, page 478, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, Trump's words further threaten America's comedy with its NATO allies, a result Putin is sure to embrace, given that, according to the commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, Putin, quote, wants to destroy, unquote, NATO. The day after Trump's threat against Turkey, the New York Times releases...
So does Michael Oren, or the EU at least.
Yes, that's exactly true. Former American citizen turned Israeli foreign officer Michael Oren, who wants to break up the European Union, that would serve Israeli interests, as he was quoted. Okay, page 478, back to the text, Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson, in our last minutes here. Quote, the day after Trump's threat against Turkey, the New York Times releases a shocking report revealing that Trump repeatedly told top aides throughout 2018 that he was planning to withdraw the United States from NATO, a decision the Times notes would be, quote, tantamount to destroying NATO, unquote, and in a single gesture also gifting Putin one of his chief geopolitical ambitions. Quote, there are few things that President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia desires more than the weakening of NATO, the military alliance that has deterred Soviet and Russian aggression for 70 years, unquote, the Times writes. The Times further notes that Trump's desire to end U.S. participation in NATO, quote, raises new worries among national security officials amid growing concern about Mr. Trump's efforts to keep his meetings with Mr. Putin secret from even his own aides, and an FBI investigation into the administration's Russia ties, unquote. Retired Admiral James G. Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, tells the Times that, quote, even discussing the idea of leaving NATO is the gift of the quote gift of the century for Putin, unquote. Okay, we're in our last minute here, so I guess I'll stop there on page 478 of Proof of Conspiracy, how Trump's international collusion is threatening American democracy by Seth Abramson. This is chapter 10. That is all about it's sort of from last year into the early days of 2019 that anticipates what we are now seeing likely the result of in terms of this Syria pullout.
Yes, and I'll say real quick, I think I'm certainly open to revisiting this and maybe finishing the chapter on another program, because this, I think, is, you can say what you want about Abramson's work. There's certainly flaws there in his philosophy and his thinking, but it doesn't offset the fact that this is extremely crucial, I think, the tying together of this reporting. And that's what he did with the 2016 campaign that so much attracted us to his work, is just the tying together of dates and times and names and people. And it looks like this is a continuation of the 2016 campaign, where this covert meetings and some off the record meetings going on, and the shaping of what the world would look like under the Trump administration. This is the continuing of this now. And now that it's less covert in terms of just covert operatives, now it's just overt governments, meeting together and basically, it seems in some ways, planning out and plotting out what these future circumstances are going to look like. And this is why ultimately I think the elements of the U.S. establishment that wants to keep the power in the hands of the U.S. Globally is very disturbed by this.
Yeah, so we'll have to finish those thoughts next week. Thank you very much. Antidote, we out.